He is one of the original revolutionaries. He has been one of the most well-known resistors to many of Dalai Lama's policies about autonomy, the middle way, and freedom and independence for Tibet. He used to run a bookstore, a very famous bookstore, but now he says he's retired and is no longer running the bookstore and has devoted his life to attempting to further the cause of Tibetan independence. And he's a laser light focus on Tibetan independence, and he's extremely well recognized in the Tibetan community. He is well known for his attitude of no compromise on Tibetan independence and freedom.
My name is Sam Mason, and on behalf of the University of Arkansas and the TEX program, I just want to thank you for giving us some of your time to do an interview today.
My pleasure. I thank you for coming all the way here to learn about Tibet. I should be knocking on your doors, and you're here, and I thank you.
Thank you. Well, first we want to start with some autobiography stuff. So, when and where were you born?
I was born in Tibet, from what I understand, somewhere around Mount Kailash. My father was a Lama in the Kagyu lay tradition, and he had a lot of followers there, having done his 3-year retreat. So somewhere around Mount Kailash, and was brought over, although I was too small to know dates at the time. It seems we were in India before the March uprising in '59, end of 1958.
Do you remember anything about the journey to India?
Well, carried on the back of a yak, because we were on a pilgrimage. It was a pleasant journey, and having done all the major pilgrimage sites, we were then at this holy lake called Revalsar, just across from here, where, as he had feared, my father, he had 2 premonitions. Sadly, both came true. One of his own early death, 2 of an impending national tragedy. And while we were performing those long 49-day prayers and mourning, the other refugees began to come, and my mother and along with my 2 elder brothers, we joined the road labor camp in Manali.
When you came to India, were you involved with some of the Tibetan schools that the Dalai Lama established?
Yes, while we were in Manali, then after His Holiness, when he was briefly in Missouri, he had started the first refugee school. Then after moving here, his officials went around. His elder sister started what is known as Tibetan Children's Village today, then known as the Nursery for Tibetan Refugee Children. Officials came to the road labor camp. My eldest brother, I thank him, because my mother was alone and with a child, he stayed with our mother to help her. My elder brother, who at one time was Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament, we were brought here to what is today the Tibetan Children's Village. From here, then sent to the first refugee in Missouri.
Can you describe your education? Do you think it gave you a good grasp about the Tibetan culture and language?
Yeah, if I had remained in that Tibetan refugee school, I would have obtained a balanced education, enough of my own language and culture, and also enough of modern science and other subjects. But while I was in that school, an American missionary group called Team came, did a few IQ tests. Some of the most intelligent boys, they knew they would be separated, gave wrong answers. In fact, my elder brother came down, says, "We are going to be separated. I gave a wrong answer. You better give a wrong answer." No, I had no option. My class teacher was the principal's wife, the late Mrs. Tsering, author of The Daughter of Tibet. And before I could give my wrong answer, I was among the finalists. And then it was a matter of pride. I had to compete and was selected to attend this public school known as Weinberg Allen School in the same town. and it is from there I graduated in 1971.
Can you describe your education at a Western school and how it compared to your Tibetan education?
Yeah, the advantage of having gone through that public school was to have enough of modern education than to have attended any good university. But the disadvantage was I had not enough of my own language. So I've been serving my community on one leg, and yet because I have enough English, I'm able to keep up with what is happening in the world at large.
So, when did you come to Dharamsala from Missouri?
After I completed school, three important things happened to me in 1968, a defining year in my life. One, we were in the separate Tibetan hostel where the senior boys, when they were in class 9, because then they had to choose the different streams of arts and science, and then I became the senior most in that Tibetan hostel, and maturity came to me while I was still in class 8. Another important thing that happened was an article in Reader's Digest called Raid into Tibet described an actual ambush Tibetan guerrillas who were then operating from Lhasang in western Nepal had conducted inside Tibet. And what went through my mind was these were the same men who opposed the Chinese at the time of the invasion. These were the same men who escorted His Holiness into exile. And there is no information about younger people join. I said, if younger people don't join, how will the struggle for freedom continue? I decided at that point in time that I would join the Lhasang guerrillas. Then the third factor was my English language teacher, the wife of the headmaster, had this rule of making us write a composition every Tuesday, second period. And one Tuesday, I suppose every schoolboy or girl would have written on that topic. The topic was my ambition. My ambition by then was to join the Tibetan guerrillas. I didn't want to commit this in a school essay. I made up a new ambition about wanting to be a doctor. I described briefly, I said Tibetan hygienic habits which were all right for the high Tibetan plateau were not good enough for the hot Indian plains. And also we did not have enough built-in natural resistance for new diseases we were encountering in the plains of. So I suppose she thought rather mature ideas for a boy of class 8. Showed it to her husband, the headmaster. They showed it to the principal who was from Australia. And I don't know what system they used at the time. Sent a copy to my sponsors, who was a millionaire in your country in Orange, California. And everyone decided Lhasang is going to be a doctor. Now to cut a long story short, when I completed school, they wanted me to come to America. They even promised me Johns Hopkins. I refused. When I refused to go to America, my sponsors arranged for me. That was my first personal audience with His Holiness, my first no to His Holiness, where before I could complete my 3 prostrations, His Holiness was almost up on his armchair. He said, why are you not going to America? Why are you not studying medicine? Don't you understand we need doctors, engineers to rebuild future Tibet? Having grown up in a public school, I did not know the Tibetan manners and courtesies. I spoke to him directly. I said, I'm not saying we don't need doctors and engineers to rebuild future Tibet. But in my view, regaining our freedom comes first. I said, if some of us don't give up our personal future for the future of the nation, where will all these doctors and engineers work? And he said, well, there's some reason to what you're saying. I said, of course, I've been thinking for this for years. I said, I'm going up to Lhasang. Please give me a talisman. So in any case, I went up to Lhasang. When that base was closed in 1974, I came back in Dharamsala. I have been here ever since.
So you spent 6 years in Lhasang?
No, almost just a year. 73 I went up, 74 I came back.
And what was your training like there?
The training was in small arms, explosives, and also espionage.
Espionage?
Yes.
And who trained you?
The trainers who had been trained by then the CIA officers had left, but there were some of these who had been trained in this base in Colorado.
Colorado.
Yes.
And And the weapons you used were supplied by?
The basic weapon was M1, but we also had submachine guns, but most importantly plastic explosives. Yes.
And do you remember where those weapons were manufactured?
They were from the United States, airdropped inside Tibet, and we had to bring them out of Tibet because the Mustang is a little too mountainous.
And so they were airdropped?
Airdropped in the Changtang Plains in Tibet and then brought over.
And you retrieved them and brought them out?
Yes.
Did you, were you ever in combat during, in your time in Mustang? Did you ever fight?
I did not see direct action. By then, after President Nixon signed that so-called Shanghai Communique in 1972, the CIA, I believe they had orders from the president, stopped helping us. And by then, also Mao had hauled up the King of Nepal, the father of this present king. And we believe he was told in no uncertain terms that China will not tolerate what they call Tibetan rebel bandits operating from his soil. So we started facing pressure from the Nepalese authorities. Now, to cut a long story short, this blew up into the Indian national media. There was going to be fighting between Nepalese army and Tibetan guerrillas. And the situation was so tense. I came down here to request His Holiness. I said, Your Holiness, you had nothing to do with starting the armed resistance. Although we have nothing against the people and the government of Nepal, we cannot surrender the struggle for freedom because this is about the survival of our nation. I said, please don't get involved. But he, in his wisdom, chose to get involved. The situation was so tense, it was felt that even sending a signed and sealed letter would not be enough. They sent a taped message. And even sending the taped message was not enough. They sent his brother-in-law to carry that taped message, who was then Minister for Security. The first place where this taped message from the Dalai Lama telling the Tibetan guerrillas to surrender was played, the commander and two of his bodyguards committed suicide.
How many Tibetan resistance fighters were there at its greatest number?
We had a system whereby to keep secrets, no guerrilla could know about a base outside his own. So even if you're caught, you cannot, even under torture, reveal what you don't know. But because I was involved in documenting, there was a Tibetan from Norway, a filmmaker, I was helping him to document, and so I had more information than others. We were 16 bases, there were supply lines and also intelligence units. And my estimate was there should have been around 2,500. But by then, some who had gone into Tibet could not get out. Some who were overage had retired.
And what were the articulated goals of the resistance army at the time?
To fight to the end or to throw the Chinese out. These were the same people who were involved in the fighting in 1949. They were involved in the uprisings in the mid-50s in eastern Tibet. And they were the ones who escorted, the Dalai Lama, thanks to the Tibetan guerrillas who had control over southern Tibet. That is where the CIA were dropping their weapons and aid. And because southern Tibet was under the control of the guerrillas, the Dalai Lama and his exiled government were able to escape to India. Once they had escorted His Holiness to India, then the guerrillas regrouped in Mustang. And my feeling was, first I had to burn my diary because I didn't have a home at the time. But I remember clearly, I've spoken about this many times. My first entry in my diary on arriving in Mustang was, I said, we are in the wrong place. What are we doing in the far west? I said, weren't the CIA looking at a map? We should have been in the far east, where Tibet, Burma and China meet. Then you blow up one bridge, a few marksmen could see that the bridges are never rebuilt. The Chinese may have tanks and trucks. Without a bridge, they would be useless. My second observation, with all my respect for those brave guerrillas, was that what we did in Tibet was wrong. The guerrillas could go in, conduct an ambush, run away. The nearest nomadic camp is wiped out. Then Next we are trying to attack the Chinese where there are no Tibetans. Where there are no Tibetans, there are no Chinese. The gap between one action and the next takes longer and longer. You have a whole lot of men up in the mountains, guns in their hands, nothing to do. You're asking for trouble, and trouble is what we got. There was infighting. The base broke up.
But you had the military capability at the time to destroy bridges.
Yes, the capability even to do a lot more. When we ambushed, when there was this power struggle after the death of Mao, there was a power struggle between Mao and Lin Biao, and the entire Western Command was being moved. And at the time, even the CIA had very little information about who were the anti-Maoists, who were the Maoists. And the Tibetan guerrillas captured a truck full of official documents in that ambush. And I believe they called it an intelligence bonanza.
And what was the general feeling of the guerrillas when they heard that tape from the Dalai Lama to disband?
A state of confusion. Because with the Dalai Lama, you have to understand, it is not just respect, it is faith. And they had to believe this was the right thing. And yet, from their own personal experience, they could not understand why it is right to surrender.
Did any of the guerrillas continue to fight after they were told to disband, or did all of them disband?
It broke up. There was some fighting among themselves. The younger ones, some of them went back. I don't know what happened to them. Many of the older guerrillas, I employed them as laborers to build the school playground and the school classrooms. And often I would see an old guerrilla with a pickaxe on the ground, staring into the sky, having some sense of the pain going through their mind. I just did not have the heart to tell them to get back into work.
How did you readjust to civilian life once you had been training as a guerrilla for a year?
Briefly, with Lodi Carey, who is now the special envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, this novelist and writer Jamyang Nobu, they got together and decided that because our senior leaders at the time did not have enough language skills to keep up with international changes and developments, we got together to start what we call the Tibetan Office of Research and Analysis. And Jamyang is really good with names because the acronym for our office name, Tora. Do you know what Tora is? Tora was the code word for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Tora in Japanese means tiger. Tora, Tora, Tora this. So while I was working in that office, and this is an idea which I still believe, I went to the Youth Congress, I said, this is something I dreamt up in 1974. I could not do it in my time because I had to respond to the uprisings in Tibet. This man from Switzerland came up with an idea where he said, what Tibetans should do is what the West did after this 1968 Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia. To internationalize that issue, they started what they called the Boy Scouts of Free Czechoslovakia. And even if people are not going to read some pamphlet from me, they would listen to their own children. So he had the idea that Tibetans should start Boy Scouts of Free Tibet. Tibetan boys and girls will participate in the international scouting activities, and even they don't listen to propaganda from the Tibetan government. Parents will listen to their own children. And scouting is an activity where children from the privileged upper classes participate. So when they got this idea, they said, now we need to train a scout master. Who do we select? And Jamyang was in the Central Executive Committee of the Youth Congress. So they said, now I have this man from Mustang in my office. Cold, hunger and thirst are not in his vocabulary. Perhaps he should be the one. But he said, you cannot speak to this man twice. You say it once and that is enough. So better somebody high up should talk to this man. So the Dalai Lama's younger sister, Chechun Pema, was also in the youth leadership at the time. So since I can't be punching the sister of the Dalai Lama, they appointed her to speak to me. To cut a long story short, I was then given special leave. While they were preparing my travel papers, I was briefly working at the children's village. From there I was supposed to be sent to Switzerland to be trained as a scoutmaster, but I got so involved in trying to improve the school. The state of the school I saw at the time was ridiculous. And I don't know who were working on my papers. My travel papers never came. I was principal of the children's village when I was just 24.
Ridiculous meaning?
Pardon?
Ridiculous. How were they? You said the state of the schools were ridiculous.
The senior boys were not much younger than I was at the time. 17, 18, they just had up to class 7. And the first thing when I arrived there was something missing. No playground. Building up mind and body. You train the mind in the classroom, you build character on the playground. And so I started working on the school playground, and on the pickaxes and shovels I had this label SL, and asked the children, do you know what this stands for? School labor. I said, no, snow leopard. Snow leopard is an endangered species. We are an endangered species. The Boy Scouts will be called snow leopards. But as I said, whoever was working on my travel papers, they never came through. I got involved in improving the school, recruiting teachers, and was appointed principal in '76.
So after you finished working at the children's village, what did you do next?
By then I was married, and my wife is an able woman. She found a job in Delhi. I was making plans to get into acting inside Tibet. In those days, His Holiness was not traveling as frequently as now. In one of his rare travels, he puts up at the Ashoka Hotel in Delhi. Those of us Tibetans in New Delhi, not many, we were lined up to get his blessings. And as he passed by, I think he noticed me. And then a security guard came down and said, His Holiness wants to see you. When I went up there, before I could complete my 3 prostrations, he said, what are you doing here? I said, I got kicked out of TCV, so I'm trying to do something from here to get into acting inside Tibet. He said, no, he called one of his assistants. He said, we cannot leave him here. He has to be brought back into Tibetan government service. I was not prepared to go back, but people came to me, my wife, my elder brother. They said, this does not happen very often. This is a direct request from His Holiness. Even if only for a year, you must go back. Okay, I came back to Tibetan government service and briefly worked at this information office, what is today the Department of Information and International Relations. That building where they are put up came up as a result of my project to build this printing press. Nartang was a press in Tibet that I had photographed, the ruins. And I was planning for the computerization of Tibetan. I conducted the first frequency study for Tibetan language. But before I could complete that project, in 1986, I was elected president of the Youth Congress.
And what year were you brought back in
1983.
1983 you were brought back.
Yes.
And in 1986?
No, 1983, after what happened was, when I was back in Tibetan government service, in those days we used to have these big general body meetings. That is where the Tibetan policy decisions were supposed to be made. The state of the meeting at the time was so disappointing. I had a stroke. The leg hospital here could not handle me. They sent me down to All India Medical Institute. Fortunately, my elder brother, who was at the time rector of the Tibetan school in Simla, he was also at this general body meeting. And with his help, I was taken to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, India's premier medical institute. When they saw me, they said, he's beyond help. And then my brother took me to where he was working in Simla, and there a Tibetan Lama, I don't know, later my brother told me, he started giving me tantric treatment. And it seems after about 3 months, I began to regain consciousness. And it was very strange. Memory coming, it was like a black and white movie being replayed. memories of my childhood in Tibet. And then there are gaps. I call them my missing files. So today, although my long-term memory, what I recovered at the time, is not too bad, my short-term memory is really difficult.
And so in 1986, you were elected
President of Tibetan Youth Congress, and then in 1987, when addressing some members of your Senate, His Holiness announced this 5-point peace proposal. We in the Youth Congress discussed the 5-point peace proposal, and I supported the 5-point peace proposal, although with 3 conditions. Firstly, that although there are 5 components, this must be treated as a single proposal. Secondly, and therefore, that no one component may be taken up in isolation of the other 4, all or nothing. Third and most important, that the 5th point, which called for earnest negotiations for the future status of Tibet, must not be taken up before the first 4 have been achieved. Because achieving the first 4 sums up to a Tibet for Tibetans, rendering the 5th redundant. But before there was any progress on the first 4, in fact, China outright rejected the 5-point peace proposal. Then in September 1988, His Holiness came up with what is known as the Strasbourg Statement. While addressing some members of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, he elaborated on how the 5-point peace proposal would be achieved by outlining the 5th point. I was also in Switzerland at the time in my position as President of the Youth Congress. After knocking on the closed doors of what the world knows as the United Nations, I just call it the Club of the Powerful. We are a nation, we have no presence there. I came back to Zurich to the Office of Tibet. Because of the Strasbourg Statement, they were working late, overtime, 5:30 or so. Somebody said, "Come quickly, BBC wants to talk to you." I said, "About what?" They said, "About the new statement from His Holiness." I said, "I haven't even heard it." They gave me a copy, and before I could give it one quick reading, the call from BBC came through. And in that telephonic interview with the BBC, I became the first Tibetan to say that this so-called middle way policy, the Strasbourg Statement, is unrealistic and unacceptable. Unrealistic in that, in my assessment, there is no benefit whatsoever for China to agree to the middle way policy. Unrealistic in that, in my view, China will never willingly and voluntarily walk away from Tibet and return Tibet to the Tibetans. And unacceptable because for me, the struggle for freedom, first and foremost, is not about winning and losing. Winning and losing is important. Winning and losing does matter. But more important than winning and losing is the question of right and wrong, truth and justice. And here I give the example of a little girl about to be raped, because rape is not an inappropriate example. When Tibet was invaded by China, our leaders appealed to the world on the grounds of the rape of Tibet. So I give this example. If there's a little girl about to be abused, what do? You have to be realistic. You have to find out, does the rapist know martial arts? Does he have a knife? Does he carry a gun? Oh, no, I should talk to him. Shall I go and look for some of his friends? I'm sorry to say, in the meanwhile, the life of that little girl, as with the future of Tibet today, is gone. For me, because I am just an ordinary human being, a humble human being. I don't know if any of you have read my write-up called The 4 Humble Truths. For this life, I have decided to have nothing to do with the 4 Noble Truths. I live by a set of principles that I call my 4 Humble Truths. The first humble truth states that freedom is a basic necessity. Freedom is the life force of a nation, and a nation not free is a nation that is dead, just like Tibet. The second humble truth states that freedom will not come by waiting. National political freedom, unlike the morning sun, unlike the evening star, unlike the summer's rain, and unlike the winter's snow, national political freedom will not come by waiting. Now, the third humble truth follows. If freedom will not come by waiting, then the third humble truth states, freedom must be fought for and won. And because freedom, national political freedom, must be fought for and won, my fourth humble truth states that freedom is not for free. There is a price for freedom, and the price for freedom is not paid in silver and gold. It is paid in the currency of life and blood. And until and unless this generation is willing and able to pay the price for freedom, the next generation will not, cannot be free.
Who are the people, aside from the Dalai Lama, the names of the people responsible for the Strasbourg proposal? Who wrote that? Who wrote that document?
That I do not know, but my suspicion at the time, although I have no written evidence for this, is that there may have been some pressure on His Holiness from Indira Gandhi, the late Indira Gandhi. She was seeking to have India in the Security Council. She was seeking to be in history as a great leader. And also for India to be in the Security Council, there would be veto from China. So what secret talks were going on at the time, I do not know. I had this feeling that there must have been some pressure on His Holiness. And then also on his own part. First of all, the last UN resolution on Tibet was in '65. No international help and support. The CIA help was withdrawn in 1972. China was getting ever more powerful and influential. So then the thought of getting some compromise. I do not know what other factors were in play, but then when His Holiness came out with the Strasbourg proposal, I became the first Tibetan to state that this is unacceptable. Because unacceptable for me, in that for me, truth, the struggle for freedom, the struggle for truth must not be treated like an item of trade in a business deal. The purpose behind business is profit. You're making profit, you do business, you continue business. You're not making profit, you change business, you stop business. Not so with the struggle for truth and justice. Not so with the struggle for freedom.
Have you ever addressed the Dalai Lama directly, your concern, your disagreement with the Strasbourg proposal and the middle way policy?
Yes, both in public at the time when he announced this, I was also there at the time. I spoke against the Strasbourg statement in personal audience, and also when he was chief guest at the Youth Congress General Body Conference, I made it very clear that it is not just that I will not, I cannot support a strategy that seeks to surrender the just struggle of the Tibetan people for freedom and for survival.
Why do you think they chose the phrase, the middle way?
Well, the teachings of the Buddha are known as the middle way, where you avoid the two extremes. But then I have gone on record to state that this so-called middle way there's nothing middle about the middle way. Surrender is the other extreme.
I know.
No, and also I have said about the middle way that in India, because India was under British rule for some 200 years, the British practice of going on the left-hand side of the road, driving on the left-hand side of the road has remained. In your country, because you achieved independence way back in 1776, you were able to discard the British practice of going on the left-hand side of the road. In your country, it is the right. So in any country, it's either left or the right, never in the middle. Because what will happen if you go in the middle of the road? You get run over. So today, we are being run over as a nation by a flood of Chinese immigrants. Already there are more Chinese in Tibet than Tibetans. The first time I crossed over from your country into Canada, 6'6" mountain police asking me for a passport. I said, who are you to ask me for a passport? I said, I'm just going over to meet my long lost second double cousins. We nomadic people, before the end of the last ice age when the Bering Strait formed, I think we nomadic peoples had contact. I said, white man, who are you to ask me for a passport? I just refused. There was a crowd of Tibetans. They then said, sir, please don't do this, show your permits. I refused. Now, they pushed me over because there was a reception committee waiting there. In this day and age, to say you crossed over into a developed country without a proper travel document, nobody will believe you. When I came out of Canada, I showed my travel document. We don't have a passport, we have this identity certificate. His Holiness travels on that. Then the border immigration officer said, when did you enter, where did you enter? I said, since when was I appointed a Canadian immigration officer? First give me my appointment letter, my salary for the last 10 years, and then I will answer your question. If not, you better have the exit stamp, because I have appeared on television, I've appeared in newspapers. They will say, you entered Canada, but you never left. I need documentary proof I left your country, you better stamp there. So I have an exit stamp without an entry stamp.
So after you left the Tibetan Youth Congress, what was the next phase of your life?
The bookworm were sitting in this little bookshop. I have talked to more people about Tibet than I did when I was a paid official in the information office. So this is the alternative information center. But now, as I said, I'm doing some writing. I'm no longer continuously in the bookshop. But during those years when I was there, that was almost a place of alternative information.
Yeah, could you describe those years for us, what it was like to be in that bookshop, running it?
Meeting all kinds of different people was an education for me as to where we had failed in our own publicity, the questions that people ask, the range of travelers who come through. And that was a learning experience for me. And then when there are no customers, time to read, to catch up on my reading. So working in the bookshop is profitable both ways. When you're selling books, you're making some money. When you're not selling books, you're doing some reading and learning.
When did you first read Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and what does that book mean for you?
Common Sense, I first read, I think, in Mustang Jamyang Nobu. He was from a very well-to-do Tibetan family, the richest Tibetan family in India. So he had taken up several mule loads of books. When I arrived there with my lonely backpack, just 2 books, ran out, and I found he had left a lot of his books. I think I first encountered Common Sense among his books that he had left there. But later on, I did a thorough reading when translating Common Sense at the Amni Merchant Institute in 1992.
And what is your opinion about that?
That is a clear and sensible statement on why any nation, any country should be free and independent.
And is it a well-known book among the Tibetan community that reads English?
Our Tibetan translation is out of print. Yes. So it was popular not only with the younger generation who had access to the English original, but with a lot of the older Tibetans, even among monks.
Really?
Yes.
While you were working at the bookshop, and you said you found failings in the Tibetan propaganda and the Tibetan outreach to foreigners, what were some of the questions the foreigners would ask about Tibet?
First of all, meaning on what evidence do we have that we are not a historian, we are not. So I was able to come up with this very brief and convincing answer to ordinary lay people's wanting to know a solid evidence on Tibetan freedom. It says, put the two languages together, written and spoken, Chinese and Tibetan. If there is any substance to China's claim that Tibet was always a part of China, Tibetan would never have survived as a separate language. The two have nothing in common. As you will know, not just, the written Tibetan is alphabetical. The Tibetan script was adapted from a 1st century Gupta script. The Hindi goes ka, ka, ga, ga, nga, Tibetan ka, 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 nga, like that. So if you put the two languages together, written and spoken, nothing in common. So people say, so what is great about that? I said, look at India. Just 200 years under British domination, this huge subcontinent with 16 written languages, 560 dialects. English today is the national language of 1.2 billion people after 200 years. If for 2,000, 5,000 years Tibet had been a part of China, Tibetan would not have survived as a separate language. So for any people willing to accept the truth, this should be evidence enough that Tibet was never a part of China. In 1980, when I went back to Tibet, after just 50 years, it was painful for me to hear young Tibetans talking to each other in Chinese. Today, the official language in Tibet is Chinese. Everywhere the signs are in Chinese. The school education is in Chinese. Why did not that happen for 2,000 years? So for anyone who wants to accept the truth, this evidence alone should be enough that Tibet was never before 1949 a part of China.
Can you describe your return to Tibet? Some of the things there that you saw?
Yeah, the first thing, the pain of hearing young Tibetans talking to each other in Chinese. But then in those days, because the public were not allowed to travel without special permit, which took very long, there was only one bus a month from Lhasa to the eastern capital, Chamdo. Here when a bus is late for 15 minutes, we are complaining. Have you waited for a bus for 1 month? In any case, while waiting for the next month's bus, because when I arrived in Lhasa, the bus for that month had left. While waiting for that, for the next month's bus, I was able to do some walking around the town and talking to people in the villages where they had very little information about, the Chinese propaganda had that the Tibetans in exile were begging, and so I was able to give them direct information about the good health of His Holiness, about the survival and success of Tibetans in exile, and that gave them courage.
And what year was that?
1980. And then for me, the most important experience I had, after taking that monthly bus to Chamdo, the eastern capital, because travel is not frequent, there was only one place to have lunch. When we stopped for lunch, I didn't want to go back for another boring Chinese meal. I took a walk, from this common kitchen. And when I went for the walk, there was somebody selling apples. I went to buy apples, and something went cold inside me. The man by the roadside selling apples was a Chinese. I said, why didn't we think of this earlier? Chinese settlers, apples don't grow in a day. And what went through my mind was, we are finished. And because there was only one bus a month, the bus from Chamdo, and there was only this one place for lunch, the bus from Chamdo to Lhasa was also there. I climbed up my bus to get my rucksack to go back. I said, for me to get experience is nothing. I must convey this crucial information to His Holiness, and we must then take urgent action, because otherwise we are finished. And while I was going for my rucksack, a Tibetan carpet seller from Nepal who had been in the Mustang guerrillas, who knew me, he said, "What are you up to?" I said, "I'm not well, I'm going back." He said, "You can't do this." While he was in Lhasa, he had heard that his mother at 92 was on her deathbed. He said, "You better hurry or you never see your mother again." If there was only one bus a month, how could he hurry? Now he was on his knees. He said, "You have a camera. I'm never going to see my mother again. You must come and photograph my dying mother." Old man on his knees, how could I say no? I went back down to Chamdo with him. I went to his hometown. I don't mention the name of his hometown for the safety of his family, but I photographed his dying mother and his family. Went back to Lhasa, came out and went directly to His Holiness. I said, "Unless we take urgent action now, Chinese are sending in settlers into Tibet, we are finished." And I said, "I'm not just making this suggestion for urgent action. I have been a volunteer before. I'm ready to be sent anywhere. I've been waiting for these many years. No orders are coming."
So that was 35 years ago. How have you been working for the Tibetan cause since then?
Well, as I said, talking is all that I can do for Tibet today. And I have done a fair amount of talking. I've done a fair amount of traveling. And now, with some of my writings, they can reach wider and further and to more people. And finally now, everyone knows about my saying no to the middle way policy. But there were 4 other major issues where I have had to say no to His Holiness. But while it is widely known, I have said no to His Holiness. There were also 5 major proposals from me, which His Holiness did not accept. In other words, said no. So I have completed a book on these issues. 5 no's from me to His Holiness. 5 no's from His Holiness to me. And then while on the subject of no, 5 other major no's of my life. Most recently, to saying no to the offer of $1 million from Taiwan. So when this book comes out, there should be some trouble.
And what did the Taiwanese expect of you for $1 million?
To lend my name so as to reach out to a wider Tibetan audience, give some credibility to their work, and for me to work for them.
And why did you say no?
The stated position of the Tibetan Youth Congress is that between the communist government in China and the nationalist government in China, with regard to the future of Tibet, we see both as being the same. Because the nationalist government in China also lays claims to Tibet as being part of China. Because if they don't do that, then the communists can undermine their activities by saying that if the nationalists come back into power, it will mean the breakup of their so-called motherland. But for us, because the nationalist government in Taiwan also claims sovereignty over Tibet, then I cannot work for them. So with them, I'm prepared to have tactical cooperation, because our enemy is the same, but I cannot have a strategic alliance. I give the example of 2 people going to Mount Kailash, a tourist and a pilgrim. Now, because they're going to the same place, they could share information. The tourist, having more resources, maybe could give some material help, food and drinks to the pilgrim. The pilgrim who should know more about Mount Kailash, maybe give some information. He may not take a lift, the pilgrim will insist on walking, but there could be cooperation. So also with Taiwan and Tibetans, although our goals are different, because our problem is the same, we could have tactical cooperation to bring down this genocidal communist regime.
Do you have any indication that there is cooperation that we might not know about between a Taiwanese underground and Tibetans? that are, you know,
At the administrative level, there may be some understanding between the two. I don't know. I have no details. But within the public, the so-called Mongolian Tibetan Affairs Commission, they have financial resources. There are plenty of Tibetans who are prepared to give up their lives to undermine communist China. So there could be some level of understanding.
Do you have any information? Do you have any kind of information about Tibetan resistance that is currently being organized within Tibet?
Tibetan resistance inside Tibet today is almost individual and spontaneous. There is no organization, there is no leadership, and there can be no strategy because there is no clarity of purpose. The tragedy with the Tibetan struggle today is we have lost clarity of purpose. With the middle way policy, now the goal is not clear. So when you don't have a clear goal, you cannot have a clear strategy. You know, I say, you can go to the best travel agent in the world. Say, please get me my tickets. Where do you want to go? I don't know. Please get me my tickets. No travel agent can help you. So also, even Taiwan, with their strategic self-interest in bringing down this genocidal communist regime in Beijing, they cannot have an alliance with us because we are not clear about our goal.
So, obviously you were for independence. What were some of the proposals you made to the Dalai Lama to that effect, to get Tibetan independence?
No, first and foremost that we have to restore clarity of purpose. And other than that even for India's security, 1/3 of India's defense budget is on the northern frontier with Tibet. When Tibet was free, what did India need? When we came into exile, all that we encountered, you can see those old photographs, a few unarmed constables in baggy shorts. I agree, they needed warmer trousers but not nuclear weapons. The other third of India's defense budget in the Kashmir Valley on the borders with Pakistan, but that also largely because of China's help and assistance. Without China's military help, Pakistan is not a problem for India, left leg. So 2/3 of India's defense budget because of China's occupation of Tibet. So India has much at stake in neutral and free Tibet.
As you know, in our country, many celebrities have gotten behind, the cause of, free Tibet, like Richard Gere and people like that. What is your opinion of these organizations in general? Do you think they're helpful? Or?
No, I am more than grateful for these celebrities to show their care and concern, and it is not in their personal interest. It may not be good for their career as no. I was in fact the guide for Richard Gere when he first came here. I was at the time in the information office, and even I was the guide for George Soros when he came here, at the time the richest man in the world. So we are more than grateful, I am more than grateful for the care and concern these celebrities have shown, but yet all of their care and concern, all the activities by Tibet support groups around the world, I have called all of these, I have put them under the broad label of brick making without a building plan. It's 1,000,000 bricks scattered on the desert surface, is 1,000,000 bricks. You want to build a house, you need a plot of land, a plan to suit that plot of land, put bricks on top of each other. All of these care and concern and support is not adding to each other towards a definite goal because the goal is not clear.
I have had several young Tibetans tell me that as long as the Western democracies have such strong financial ties with China, there's very little that Western democracies can do to actually help Tibet?
It is true in the short term, but in the long term, a democratic, market-oriented China will be more in the interest of multinationals than, today their position in China is very insecure. In a democratic China, they could do more business with more guarantees for their future. So it is in the long-term interest. It may not be in their short-term interest, but it will be in the long-term interest of multinationals to see a democratic China. And today, goods made in China are flooding the world market. Any idea why goods made in China are cheaper than goods made in the West? Not because of their superior technology, not because of their better management. Two factors. In fact, I keep saying, people in the free world, it is morally wrong to buy made in China. People do it just because it is cheap. Do you know why it is cheap? All the natural resources they are stealing from the occupied countries is free. All the slave labor they use of political prisoners in the early stages of mining or transportation is free. When your raw material is free, when much of your early labor is free, why shouldn't your goods be cheaper? And then, because China is a planned economy, they have the means to undercut, to artificially bring down their prices, to undercut their international competition. Once the competition is gone, they can play with prices as they please. But more importantly for me, morally, people in the free world buying made in China is wrong, because made in China is due to all the natural resources they are taking away free, stealing from the occupied countries, and all the slave labor they use of political prisoners.
What can Westerners, young Westerners, do to help the Tibetan cause? Not by made in China, but what else?
Is to write to our leaders to bring sense and reality to their minds, that hoping and waiting for China to willingly and voluntarily walk away is not going to happen. If somehow Tibetan friends in the West can bring home to our leadership the reality that the middle way cannot and will not work, that will be the biggest help you can do to the Tibetan people. And also to bring home to the mind of your leaders that why are you listening to these few refugees in exile? Listen to the vote for freedom inside Tibet. People inside Tibet are voting for freedom with their lives. Where else in the world do we have so many self-immolations for freedom?
Why do you think the Dalai Lama is so popular? He's very popular in our country. We brought him to the University of Arkansas, where I teach, and we put him in a basketball arena, and we sold 12,000 tickets just like that. And this happens wherever he goes. Why?
A number of factors. The image of His Holiness the Dalai Lama being so popular and respected around the world, there are a number of factors. First of all, it is, I think, thanks to the teachings of the Buddha, which are gaining ground everywhere in the world. And because the Dalai Lama today is perhaps the most important living Buddhist leader and teacher, then there is a great deal of popularity and interest in his person, in his teachings. And then another important factor could be his own character, his own wisdom, his own learning, and having, apart from the failed political leadership, as a spiritual leader, today I cannot think of another individual who can compare with him in terms of the long years that he has lived up to. And then I think the third important factor is the respect given to him by the Tibetan people. this unquestioning, not just respect, more than respect, it is the faith of the Tibetan people in his person, in his teachings, that then brings about a wider interest in people around the world. Who is this person, this individual, where the Tibetan people are prepared to die in his name? So I think these are the three important factors.
If Tibet were to gain independence tomorrow, what plans would you have to rebuild Tibet? How would you want to rebuild Tibetan culture and eradicate the Chinese influence?
Yes, in a future free Tibet, one most important fact that we must do is restore Tibetan language as the medium of governance, as the medium of education. Today, Chinese is the official language in Tibet. Chinese is the medium of instruction. And when we talk about preserving culture, different components of culture, even I'm not going to be wearing the traditional Tibetan cloak anymore. Different components of the culture may change, but a culture has many components. What gives any culture unity and identity is the language. And I liken language, I compare language to the role of the thread in a necklace or a rosary. You can have 108 beads, but without a thread, you don't have a necklace or a rosary. So it is language which gives unity and identity to culture. And for the survival, long-term survival of Tibetan culture, my efforts will be at reviving Tibetan as the medium of governance, as the medium of communication and education. In fact, when I was principal of the Tibetan Children's Village, preparing for future Tibet, I introduced, we have a lot of freedom in India for junior level school education. I introduced Tibetan as the medium of education in the primary school to prepare the grounds for having Tibetan as the medium of education and governance in the future Tibet. So that would be the one important step for me to take in the future free Tibet.
I have one more question. What are your hopes for the future of Tibet?
I have to be realistic, no hope. It is good to be hopeful, it is more important, it is necessary to be realistic. And because of the middle way policy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have lost clarity of purpose. We no longer have a meaningful struggle for freedom. Quite often I tell people, we are an endangered species. Take a good look. We are already outnumbered in our homeland. More and more and more Chinese are moving in. I forget what journal it was. Somebody sent me a photocopy of an interview with His Holiness, wherein, among other things, he was quoted as having said, yes, the Chinese, it is true the Chinese have done many bad things in Tibet, but it is also true they have done some good things. Tibet was a backward country. They have brought in some development, such as the railway. His Holiness had given the railway as an example of something good the Chinese have done in Tibet. Any idea how I see the railway? What I call the railway? The final nail in the coffin. Now it is no longer bus loads. It is train loads of Chinese immigrants who are coming in. It is no longer truckloads. It is train loads of Tibetan resources they are taking away. This is the final nail in the coffin. We are finished.
One final question. Do you think the Dalai Lama will ever return to Tibet during this lifetime in any way?
I cannot speak on his behalf as to what decision he will take as an individual, but as a leader of the Tibetan people, returning to a free Tibet will not happen for the simple reason he has, on the one hand, ruled out freedom as the goal of a struggle. We no longer have a struggle for freedom. He has given up his role as political leader of the Tibetan people. He's calling for democracy. Democracy is an internal affair. That can wait. The struggle for freedom is about life and death. You know, did I give you this example of two families competing for a plot of land to build their family home? One family gets into an argument about the color of the walls. In the meanwhile, the other family gets the land and builds the house. I'm not saying the colors of the wall are not important. They are important. But that comes after you build the house. You can change, every room can have a different color. You can have every wall having a different color. But getting that land comes first. So a future free Tibet could have elections every year, every 5 years, whatever. Democracy is an internal affair. That can wait, that can come later. The struggle for life and death, the struggle of freedom, that must happen now.
What do you say to those Tibetans who tell me that the Dalai Lama sees further down the road than they do, and therefore they support, autonomy because he sees things?
As far as I know, there has been no Tibetan who could see the future. He could not see the Chinese coming. He has no right to claim that he can see they are not going. With the Chinese invasion, Mao openly stated in that interview with Edgar Snow, when it all looked clear that the communists were going to win in the Yan'an caves, he says, now it is all clear that you're going to form the next government in China. What are your foreign policy options? And it was a very sarcastic and cynical answer. He said, my first foreign policy decision will be to pay a foreign debt to Tibet, meaning take revenge. Firstly, not allowing the Allies to help China when Japan invaded China during the Second World War. Secondly, when the communists were running away from the nationalists during the Civil War, Tibetans in the border areas attacked the communists. So when the Dalai Lama could not learn the lesson of an openly declared intention to invade China, when he could not see the Chinese coming, he has no right to claim that he sees the future, that we cannot throw them out. There is no Tibetan who knows the future. It is the duty of leaders to learn the lessons of history. Don't make any pretense at trying to look into the future. It has not been given to man to know the future. It has been given to us to learn the lessons of history. The lessons of history says that unless you have your defenses in place, you will be under attack.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.